sat down with Claire to ask her a few questions. Question 1. You write contemporary romances. What kind of research do you do for your books?
One of the things I love most about contemporary romance is the escapist element of it. You're reading about quite far out characters and themes, mega billionaires and sheiks and royals and all sorts of things that are well outside the rigors of day-to-day life. So in terms of research, it's not really something that you can necessarily do in a hands-on way. I think that reading contemporary romance is one of the best ways to research the genre and feel really comfortable with the conventions of it. When it comes to setting a book in an existing place, like an island in Greece or a city in Europe or America, I will do a lot of online research. I tend to borrow from places that I've been before. So when about 10 years ago, I lived overseas for 4 years in the UK, and we did a lot of travel through Europe. So that's quite a convenient launching pad for ideas. But I also do a lot of just letting my imagination go. It's one of those things where if it's plausible, then you can put it in a contemporary romance book. I tend to base things away from real events so that there's not that fact-checking required. And the biggest thing in contemporary romance that it's important to get right is the emotion. So if I'm giving my characters emotional issues or backstories that require research, that's where I will really put a lot of time and energy into making sure that I do their story justice. So someone who's come through a traumatic breakdown of a marriage, or who's had an unpleasant childhood experience, someone who has overcome alcohol or drug addiction, these are things that I really don't want to be flippant with if I'm utilizing those for a story. So I do a lot of reading of first-hand experience, blogs on the internet, or borrow memoirs from the library, so that I can really make sure that the experience of the character do justice to that situation.
Question 2. What inspires you to write?
I'm someone who can't read a book, watch a movie, hear a friend's story, really be a participant in any kind of life without feeling inspired to write. It's one of the questions I get asked a lot is, where do your ideas come from? And the problem is actually either switching the ideas off or just finding the time to write them. I really do think that inspiration as a writer comes from being a good question asker. So you might get an idea for a character, but then it's thinking, well, how does that affect the character's life? And what happens to them then? And what obstacle do they have to overcome? What in their past leads them to overcome that, or makes it difficult for them to overcome that? Do they have trust issues that make it impossible for them to rely on the one person that they need to progress to this next level of the quest, or whatever sort of story it is that you're writing? I think that particularly with the sorts of books I write that are essentially about human connection and emotional resonance, inspiration is everywhere. It's watching the news at night and hearing a story about something remarkable that's happened to someone, and you think, how does that affect them? What will they take from that going forward? Will it make it easier or harder for them to have those connections? So in terms of inspiration, I guess it's everywhere. It's just about turning yourself on to see it, and not just to see it, but to think that every story starts with a tiny flicker of an idea that then you as a writer expand. You as a writer know that you are in control of finding the conflict. And what is the story there? It's not very interesting if it's just a boy meets a girl and they have everything in common and then they get married. Far more interesting if boy meets girl, discovers that she's a member of a family who destroyed his one chance at a political career, or something in their history that means that it's really difficult for them to actually connect and overcome that. And the strength of their love and the way that the reader believes in that love has to be done so well that you have no doubt that their connection is lasting. So inspiration is everywhere, and it's just a matter of the more books you write, the more you learn to trust it, and the more you learn to know if it is actually has legs to carry a story from beginning to end.
Question 3. What's your favorite thing about romance?
My favourite thing about romance is actually really hard to choose because there's just so much to love. I've always been drawn to reading romance and to romance movies, any kind of happily ever after love story I just love. As a child, I read The Babysitter's Club because I loved the romance between Marianne and, what was his name? It started with a D, I seem to think. Oh, I spent years and years of my teenage life falling in love with those books and characters. And it was the romance that propelled me through it. Like a lot of stories, a sort of not quite love story is what's used to keep viewers or readers coming back. Like Ross and Rachel in Friends is another great example, or Lois and Clark in Superman. I think that we all are drawn to the hope of romance and the will they or won't they nature of it. As a devoted reader of romance, I know that my hero and heroine, when I pick up a book, are going to end up together at the end of the story. But it's how that will happen. How will these two characters fall in love? How will they overcome their obstacles? Conflict is very important to a good romance because if it's all smooth sailing, it's kind of boring. Though that might be what you wish for in real life, of course. In a book, you want something that's a little more dramatic. I think that particularly for the sorts of romances that I read, escapism is a great element as well. You know, there's this level of fantasy that comes from an angsty contemporary romance where one of the characters might be a billionaire with private helicopters and mansions all over the world. They own hotels, or they're a politician or a bodyguard, or it's something well and truly outside the realm of normal life, which is a lot of fun to lose yourself in for a few hours. The other great thing about romances is, and within romance, there are so many subgenres and different types of romance, but certainly in the books that I'm drawn to, which is contemporary category romance, they're short. They're 50 to 55,000 words, which means you get an incredibly fulfilling emotional story within a few hours. I can usually read, say, a Mills and Boon in the time that it would take me to watch a movie. So I would always choose to read the book rather than watch a film. I love the emotional payoff. It's quite unfortunate that romance is often derided as being silly or frivolous, and I think that there's a whole area of exploration there about that being sort of a form of patriarchal expression, because romance is usually female written and the heroines are the characters who are pivotal to the plot and who tend to get there happily ever after. It is a real shame, because what we can look at quite clearly when we see sales figures is that romance is in fact the biggest selling genre in the world. A Mills and Boon sells somewhere in the world every 4 seconds, and that's not including digital copies or op shop copies or library borrows. That's just sales of, you go into a W.H. Smith or a bookshop and pick up a copy off the shelves. So it is enduringly popular, and I think that that's because we all love love. We love happily ever after, and particularly when times are tough and things are hard, romance is a genre that you can turn to and know that it's a safe place to read.
Question 4. Have you ever written books in other genres?
I love to read really widely in lots of genres, but romance is what I've always written. I guess that romance is such a broad church. There's not just one type. There are so many different subgenres of romance in terms of characterization and historical settings or contemporary settings. I have, within that broad church of romance, experimented with writing historical romance, so a Jane Austen style romance, and writing a bit of a thriller with heavy romantic overtones. So I like the idea of playing around within romance, but for me, it always has to have two characters who are sort of fated to be together and work their way through their issues alongside anything else that's taking place at the same time.
Question 5. How did you come to write your first novel?
I actually wrote my first romance novel when I was 15 years old. I'd grown up with a mum who was an antique dealer, and we used to get dragged around to lots of op shops and antique shops on weekends, and I would always come home with stacks of Mills and Boons from when I was about 12 years old. I loved them. I really loved the sort of 1980s Mills and Boons of Emma Darcy, Penny Jordan, and I really did grow up reading them, as well as Babysitters Clubs and other sorts of things. So when I came to write, and writing is a very seductive passion, especially if you're a bit of a control freak like I am, I loved the idea of creating dynamic characters and setting them in this uber fantasy landscape, but having complete control over what happened to them. So I worked really hard, and I wrote a full Mills and Boon, which I printed off and wrapped up in pink ribbon and sent across the world to London. And I waited, and it was very wisely rejected about 2 months later. I mean, it was. I still have the printed out manuscript, so I can verify that it was very poor, but it continued to be what I thought about whenever I wanted to write. The ideas that would come flooding to me were always contemporary romance. So I lived my life, and I think that as a writer, you always write. Even if you're not writing a book, I think that the pull and the lure of the written word is so strong that you can't ignore it. So I would write incredibly long emails to friends, or I wrote fan fiction, hand wrote, when I was in school with a girlfriend of mine, back and forth. I had a website that I wrote about lots of different things, because the medium of expressing yourself through writing was what I loved doing. It was when I was about 22 and we'd moved to London that I really started to write again in earnest, and to think that this was something I might like to do. I was working full-time back then in a different job, and so when I came home from work, I was often an hour ahead of my now husband, and so I would take that time to sit out on the balcony with a glass of wine and some raspberries, and I would sit there under all the plane trails going into Heathrow, and I would write. And back in those days, I was still learning my craft and my skills, and it would take me a very long time. It was like pulling hen's teeth. I didn't quite feel an intuitive understanding of the narrative structure, despite having read and read and read, which I think is the best preparation you can do to be a writer. I still felt like I was full of self-doubt about, I guess I had the intuitive understanding, but I wasn't trusting it. So it would take me about an hour to write 800 words. And so it was slow going with that first book. But I made myself finish it, even after the self-doubt had sort of made me lose the passion for the project and made me doubt if it was any good. We came back to Australia, and I don't think I submitted that book or did anything with it. I think I just saw it as a learning project. And then I started my next book and my next book. Eventually I started submitting to Mills and Boon, and they receive an incredible amount of manuscripts each year. They do read them all. They're an incredible publisher for that. You don't need an agent to approach them, and they will quite often give feedback. But I was rejected a few times on the hop, and once you've submitted, it's a long wait. It can be 3 to 6 months before you hear back. So the timing of it was quite wonderful in a way, in that it was right at the build-up of the self-publishing availability. So it was 2014 in May when I had a book that I thought was really great, and Mills and Boon didn't want it, but I didn't want to let it go. And I self-published it with no expectation that it would ever sell or sell well. And to my surprise, it did, from the first day that it was loaded up onto Amazon. And from then on, it all sort of snowballed. I had fallen in love with writing, and I'd grown in confidence as a writer. And having people reading my books was very validating. And from that moment on, I continued to self-publish for about a year before Mills and Boon offered me a publishing contract. And now I'm fortunate enough to be able to write for Mills and Boon, as well as continue to self-publish contemporary romance titles online.
Question 6. Have you ever read anything that made you feel differently about fiction?
things that I tell people when they're starting out in writing and they doubt their own ability to tell a story is how innate it is to us as humans to tell stories. You know, it's something that all cultures around the world through all periods of time share. We tell stories. It's a way that, yes, we derive entertainment, but it's also a way that we learn and we grow and we feel and we emote. And when I read a story, I want to feel what I feel. When I write a story, I want to be moved. I want to really come to care for the characters. I want to care about their journeys. And I want to feel at the end that it's been satisfactorily concluded. I don't always need a happy ending, though if there's not a happy ending, I like to know that going in so that I can brace myself for impact. But I think the most important thing fiction can do is resonate with us on a human level. It can be humor, you know, it doesn't have to be that it's depressing or scary or sad. It's just making you feel more alive and in connection with your own feelings. And yes, entertaining you. I think that entertainment is a hugely important part of why we read. So one of the books that I think changed me forever, and I've only read it once because it was so beautiful and so harrowing and connected with me so deeply that I'm scared to go back and read it again in case it affects me in the same way, and I'm scared to go back in case it doesn't affect me in the same way and I'm disappointed. It was the most perfect experience that I don't want to tamper with, was The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. It's also the only time I've ever written to an author to tell them how much I loved their book. I read it very quickly. I found it completely compelling. I loved the characters. And when I finished it, it was when I lived in the UK, and I remember I was on the tube and I read it on the tube, and then I got off and I read it while I walked, and then I got to where I was going and I was visiting friends, and I walked into their lounge room and said, I can't talk, I just have to finish this. And I had about 5 pages left, and I sat there and I read it, and afterwards I cried and I cried. I couldn't believe how much it affected me and how beautiful and perfect and somber and incredibly powerful the ending was. It was just an immense book. I really loved it. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't read it and you've only seen the film, or you haven't seen the film, please read the book first, because it is just such a powerful story. With that being said, I raved about it like that to my mum, and she didn't like it at all. She actually didn't even finish it. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind with fiction. It affects all of us differently, and it affects us differently depending on where we're at. But the most important thing, in my opinion, that fiction can do, irrespective of the genre, is to connect with you and move you.
Question 7. Why do you think romance is such a universally popular genre?
So it's really interesting that prior to World War II, Mills and Boon were actually a general publisher. They published lots of different genres of books. But during the war, paper became so expensive, they could only print what they knew would sell, and that was romance. So we have this thing where romance has been popular for millennia, really. I mean, look at the enduring success of Jane Austen. She's one of the most read icons of literature in history, and she writes stories about people falling in love and the minutiae of daily life. There's nothing of overwhelming merit in that necessarily. It's not a super academic topic. It's the comings and goings of families and their interactions with one another, and watching people fall in love, people who shouldn't love each other, who have very little in common. So there's something about that mystery and that drama that draws us in. And I wonder if it's because we like to see ourselves and our capacity for love reflected on the page, or is it that on the first page a question is asked, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. Well, we have the scene set and the question asked, is he in want of a wife? And if so, how does he procure one, and who? So these questions then are answered throughout the book, but they're compelling watching them be answered. I think that that same sense of mystery and the fact that we recognize ourselves in the books we read, even the ones that are far-flung. And as I've said a few times, romance is such a broad church. I have friends who write intergalactic cyborg romances and werewolf romances. And so it's when I say we want to see ourselves reflected in the books, I don't mean our literal selves. I mean our capacity for love and the gauntlet of emotions that we feel: envy, sadness, loss, love, hope, optimism, reflected in these stories. And I just don't know if there's anything more compelling than romance. I think that one of my favorite things to say is that Die Hard is a romance. At its core, you have all this violence and the adrenaline high of John McClane in a high-rise chasing out the bad guys. But what they finish with, what's the most compelling aspect of that, is whether or not he and Holly will reconnect at the end of the movie, whether or not she'll welcome him back into her life. They set that up at the beginning of the book. We know that he's coming to her to having off the back of their divorce or their breakup, and we have that question percolating in the back of our mind through the whole movie, and it's that which they give us as a resolution at the end. So I can't say definitively why romance is enduringly popular, but anecdotally it is, and I love that it is. And I'm not someone who would ever denigrate the romance reading industry, because how can you do that without saying that basically everybody is wrong?
Question 8. What would romance novels be like in a matriarchal society?
Okay, so this is a great question. It's important to know that when we talk about romance novels, we're not simply talking about heterosexual romance. Romance has always been a really strong yardstick of the times and of social identity and social expression. And as I think that the rise of self-publishing has really made it possible for expressions that might have been seen as too tricky for traditional publishers to support necessarily at the time, have really found their feet and have gained enormous support and a really important place online. And we're seeing that carried through to traditional publishing as well. So that includes male-male, female-female, menage romance, lots of different, as I've said, subgenres within the romance category. So in terms of how being in a matriarchal society would affect romance novels, it's really difficult to see that it would necessarily change. I think that power dynamics are something that have always been played with in romance novels, and certainly the books that we might have read in the 70s or that were written in the 70s and 80s saw a far more dominant male hero, if we're talking about a heterosexual romance, and perhaps a more on the face of it submissive heroine. However, I do question that interpretation a little, in that it's always been my takeaway, and as someone who grew up reading books that were largely written in those eras, that it was still the heroine who had the power. She might have seemed as though she were in a less significant bargaining position for much of the book. But what I really like about romance is seeing the character who comes into the story in what is seen to be more of a position of power and has more confidence and arrogance and authority, really brought to their knees by the fact that they're vulnerable to love, that they've opened their heart to love, and that they're powerless to control that. And so that giving up of control is incredibly important in romance, because let's face it, when you love someone, you are sort of at the whim of whether or not they love you and how those feelings will play out and whether or not you can actually make one another happy. So I think that those power dynamics might, on the face of it, change a little bit in a matriarchal society, but it's whatever the gender, whatever it is, you're talking about people finding their dynamic and someone having to let down their boundaries to allow themselves the full experience of loving and being loved.
Question 9. Has the Metoo movement changed the romance publishing industry?
The Me Too movement is something that I'm actually asked about quite often if I'm speaking at events, and how it has affected romance writing. And as someone who's relatively new to romance writing but not romance reading, my feeling is that yes, it creates a clear set of guidelines for people perhaps coming into the industry or from the outside of the industry. Maybe it creates a set of rules for publishers to follow, but I think for diehard readers of romance and writers of romance, the main issues that are grappled with by a movement like Me Too are things like consent and power and respect. And these are things that I've always seen handled well in the books that I've read. Consent is something that we as a reader need to know is there. I don't necessarily think that it needs to be heavy-handed in how it's written on the page in terms of dialogue, but as a reader, I'm looking to be in both viewpoints, or potentially if you're writing a heterosexual romance, in the heroine's viewpoint, so that we know that there is that consent, that there's no doubt that this is two people who really want to be together. I've said that playing with power is something that is fun to do in romance, but it is something that you have to be careful you don't ever have a character abusing their position of power to get what they want from a character who isn't interested. So even if I were writing a book where a character was using their more dominant position to achieve something that they really wanted, and that meant another character who was in less of a dominant position had to give something up, I would immediately switch to that character who was seen to be in the less dominant position's point of view, so that we could see them rationalizing it in their brain and coming to the realization that actually this is what they would get out of it, or this is why they wanted to go along with it, this is how they could get out of going along with it. So it's very important that these books be empowering, and while still keeping their sense of fun and the things that readers look for when they turn to these books. You know, they're not, I think that they are a good yardstick for where society's at. And in recent times, women have never been more able to speak for themselves and to hold positions comparable to men. That's not to say there's not a long way to go, because there is, but it's important that the books reflect that, and that we feel the strength and the confidence that comes from our female characters. I guess I feel that power comes in lots of different modes, and it's important to write a character who you know that even when their back is against the wall would have the strength to only do what they wanted. So I guess the Me Too movement has made everybody very consciously aware of things that we have instinctively been doing or instinctively been looking for a really long time.
Question 10. Why is it so important for romance novels to finish with a happily ever after?
Happily ever afters are a hugely important part of a romance. There is also a happily for now, but that's never been good enough for me. I like to know the characters are going to be together forever without a shadow of a doubt. I am a huge believer in epilogues for this reason, as I think a lot of romance readers are. I like to see the sweeping end and the beautiful coming together of my characters, but then I like to see them in 5 years' time with, 2 kids and a home in the country and all the things that we know that they've wanted throughout the course of the book. It's one of my biggest things with even something like, to turn to movies, Dirty Dancing, which I loved, of course, like most of the world. But I would have loved an epilogue over the credits of seeing Johnny and Baby getting married, in 5 years' time after she's graduated and saved the world, joined the Peace Corps, whatever it is that she does. But the happy ending is what keeps us going through the angst of the book. And romance novels are at their heart quite conflict driven. So if you have the right setup, you spend a lot of the book wondering if the couple is going to find their way back together. And it's only by giving them this great happily ever after that you can be confident that they've done that. So I think the expectation of romance readers is definitely that they will get that happily ever after at the end of the book. And it provides us with that safe place that we're craving, particularly when times are tough, to know that everything's going to turn out okay.